Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Today, we are looking at what we've learned over the last year about how well universal credit has been working in Glasgow. This is not just a webinar about Glasgow in Scotland. We are pleased to be joined by many people from across the UK. I think there's a lot of interest in how universal credit is designed, the rate it's paid at, but also how it's delivered and what the experiences of recipients are at a local and regional level. So thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be hearing the findings from a new study that was published on Monday by a research team at Glasgow University and Poverty Alliance. But in many ways it's been Universal Credit Week at JRF. We've also published findings of a study in Northern Ireland, looking also at how effective the policy is working in another devolved context. So we're learning a lot about a policy that has been around the block for a while now, and we hope that you will be interested in our findings and enjoying the chat about our recommendations and ideas for improving universal credit. So before we get going, I want to introduce who's with us today. We'll be joined by two of the co-authors of our Glasgow study, who are Professor Sharon Wright, who's Professor of Social Policy at the University of Glasgow, and Laura Robertson, who is Research Officer with the Poverty Alliance. They'll be talking about the findings shortly. And then they'll be joined by Lorraine McGrath, who is Chief Executive of the Simon Community in Scotland, and we were really keen to have an expert practitioner view on how well universal credit can be made to work for people who experience some of the biggest types of risk, vulnerability and exclusion in society, including people who have multiple exclusion homelessness. So we were hearing from Lorraine in response to the research findings. Just some housekeeping before we get going then. So today, all participants' microphones and video links will be off for the duration of the webinar. You'll see the hosts and the speakers during this session. We'll split this into two halves. So we'll have the presentations and response, and then we'll go into questions in the second half hour. So all questions that you've got, if you pop them on the Q&A channel that you'll see on the Zoom screen, you can ask questions at any point during the session, but they'll only be answered during the Q&A second half of the webinar, and we'll try and leave plenty of time to get through as many questions as possible. The chat function is switched off during this webinar, and that's because of the large number of people who've joined us. More than 200 sign-ups from across the UK. We're delighted about that, but we do ask you to post your questions in the Q&A channel. So this session is being recorded and will be made available as soon as possible to watch back after today. Only other Zoom rules being definitely bring your own mug for this session. And if this was the news, I'd be saying children asking for a second chocolate biscuit, definitely optional for this morning. Okay. One word to say about the theme then. In our work at the JRF, we're about solving poverty, and now more than ever, social security, along with housing and work, need to create a lifeline to hold people steady, a lifeline to rely on in the storm that's coming in the economy, and a lifeline that helps to keep us out of poverty. So when we ask ourselves, how well has UC been serving people? Those are some of the questions we have in our mind. We are acutely aware that the research you're going to hear about this morning was completed well before the pandemic. So it gives us a really rich baseline telling us what was happening, if you like, below the surface before the pandemic hit. Since then, a great deal has changed. For example, over 170,000 new claims since the middle of March in Scotland alone. And the system has, in many ways, passed that test of dealing with that surge and ensuring people are paid on time and accurately. However, we know there are many other challenges still to be addressed. The system is being tested in terms of adequacy, flexibility. And so we're going to hear today about some of those other reforms that have to happen, not just as we come out of the crisis phase, but as we look ahead and thinking about what's going to be happening in the jobs market. What does that mean for conditionality in the claimant commitment? What does that mean for the flexibilities that exist in the devolved countries of the UK? So, to highlight some of those challenges and to stimulate our discussion, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome, first of all, Sharon Wright, who is going to be setting out some of the findings from our research. She'll be followed by Laura from Poverty Alliance, and then we'll come to Lorraine to respond from Simon Community Scotland. Welcome, thanks for joining us, all of you. Over to Sharon.
Thanks, Jim. Morning, everybody. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen, fingers crossed. Here we go. So today we're thinking about how well universal credit supports people in Glasgow, and this is a research project that I've been undertaking with the Poverty Alliance and other colleagues at Glasgow University. We were really interested to find out how universal credit full service operated in Glasgow, and it was a place-based approach that we adopted. So we were interested in looking just at the one city and trying to get an overview of a lot of different aspects of how the rollout of full service operated. Full service was introduced between September and December 2018 to new claimants and claimants with a change of circumstances. We thought it was particularly interesting because Scotland has its own social security system, and that's a massive improvement for many people. But universal credit remains the main social security benefit for working age people. And there are some Scottish flexibilities. So people can choose the frequency of their payments and whether or not their payment for housing is made directly to their landlord. So part of what we were interested in finding out was, does that make a difference? Is it better for people in Scotland because of that flexibility? So an important piece of the context is that ahead of Glasgow's rollout of full service universal credit, Glasgow City Council set aside £2 million to boost a network of community-based support. So that was specifically designed to help people and support them in that phase of universal credit. One of the main parts of that we interacted with was the universal credit support hubs. The research looked at how well universal credit supports people in Glasgow, and we were interested in lived experiences from 2 points of view: the lived experience of claimants and the lived experience of job centre staff. We were really very fortunate that DWP gave us access to Glasgow job centres, and we were able to go in behind the scenes and talk to a whole range of staff. We talked to managers, work coaches, people who worked in service centres and the call centres, and really get a good sense of how the Job Centre Plus network operated across the city. We also talked to people who had lived experience of receiving universal credit full service. We interviewed people twice. So first of all, when they began their claim, and then a few months later to see how it had panned out, how it had affected them. And then after that, we conducted 2 deliberative workshops because we wanted to find out how other practitioners in the city were experiencing the system. So that also included Job Centre Plus work coaches, as well as people from welfare rights and housing organisations, for example. So to the findings, what did we find out? First of all, claimants' experiences. The main finding was that people experienced financial insecurity, and a core part of that was the initial waiting period of 5 weeks. A lot of attention has been drawn to the 5-week wait by other research reports and other political debates, and our findings here really reinforce that the 5-week waiting period is one of the most difficult aspects of universal credit. Many people had financial difficulties during that period. That included those who had taken an advance that they later had to repay, and those who didn't take the advance and had really very great difficulties in affording the basics. So having food, relying on family members, not being able to afford very basic things. Most felt that they had to take an advance payment because it was the only way to get by during those 5 weeks, and they worried a lot about getting into rent arrears. There were reports of hunger and struggling with the repayments alongside other deductions. So an ongoing issue is the high level of income loss due to deductions for repayments of the advances, but also other issues maybe that preceded, so existing rent arrears or other sorts of deductions. People found it difficult to manage their budgets between the monthly payment of universal credit. That was a major challenge. And what's important here is it's not necessarily to do with the frequency of payment, but the overriding issue is the inadequacy of the level at which universal credit is paid. So whether you get it fortnightly or monthly, it's not enough to cover all of the essentials of living, and many people found that very difficult. There were issues with housing payments and fear of rent arrears. It's hard to underestimate the level of anxiety that's associated with universal credit, and we found it quite a dilemma as a research team, because we want to highlight the issues which can be improved about universal credit, and we want to talk about the problems, but we don't want to increase fear that's already very prevalent amongst claimants and people who might have to move on to universal credit. And housing was an important aspect that's different in universal credit from legacy benefits, that people really were worried that they were going to lose their home because of payment problems and inadequate income. Claimants told us that they struggled from month to month, and that there were a lot of demands on that amount of money. So childcare, rent, food, heat were all pulling them in different directions. One claimant told us that 5th week I'm basically skint, dragging things out of the freezer. And another said it's enough to survive on, it's not enough to live on, if that makes any sense to you. You'll not starve, but you'll not live. And that was a common experience. So we had people in this study who were working before, when they first came on, and also who moved into work. And it didn't make much of a difference whether people were in employment or unemployed. They still had financial problems under universal credit. We were also interested in claimants' lived experiences of interacting with the system. And what people told us is that they had generally positive relationships with their work coaches. In Glasgow, these claimants that we spoke to said that they found their work coaches helpful, and that they seemed to care about their lives and how they were getting on. And that's a very good sign, and something that's different from previous research that I've been involved in other parts of the UK. Claimants' experiences of universal credit online were mixed. So universal credit is mainly, almost entirely available online. So people often accessed it via their smartphone or via their tablet. And some of the people we talked to felt the online system was easy to navigate, but challenging for people without IT skills or easy access. So some people found it very straightforward and no problem at all, but others really struggled. And that could be for quite basic reasons. For example, not having an adequate smartphone. You know, I spoke to someone who had a cracked screen on their smartphone, made it very difficult to see their claimant commitment or their to-do list in the app. So for people with language and also literacy difficulties, that could also create a big challenge. Part of the challenge was beginning a claim and getting onto the system, and part of the difficulty was in lacking human contact. So claimants told us that they wanted more face-to-face support and that they wanted to be able to speak to someone at least on the phone rather than dealing with an impersonal system. So one person said, I mean, all this online stuff for me is so difficult. It's like it's working even harder than having a job. I mean, I was working for a couple of months and it was easy compared to what it is trying to do that on the computer and getting stuck. They just wanted to speak to someone and they just wanted some help. And that was a big part of the anxiety for people who found the IT difficult. Claimants also told us about their experiences of conditionality and sanctions. Many struggled with the 35-hour-a-week job search expectations. That's the default for universal credit. And they worried that they weren't being seen to do enough, even if they were very active. There was a feeling that the job centre had eased up on sanctioning though, but it didn't stop claimants being very worried about getting a sanction. And there was particular anxiety for disabled people and people with physical and mental health conditions, especially if they were due to attend a work capability assessment or if they'd had one already. One claimant said, well, she, the work coach, did say something that made me nervous and made me feel under pressure. She says, if you've got different bits on your phone that you access, one of the bits is called a to-do list. You need to be on that phone checking it every day, looking for work and blah, blah, blah. And I can text you on your to-do list. You need to do this. And then, of course, if you don't do that, they'll stop your money. So even though claimants felt that it wasn't so bad with sanctions as it maybe had been a few years ago, it was still there in the background and it created a sort of background anxiety that framed their interactions with the job centre and their interactions with universal credit. But it's also worth noting here that part of the reason they're talking about a to-do list on a phone is a major innovation that came with full service universal credit, and that is the journal. So it didn't used to be possible under live service for claimants to directly contact their work coach, but under full service that is possible, and that was a really important way in which people were able to avoid sanctions because they could communicate and they could say, I can't make my appointment, can I rearrange it because I've got a legitimate reason. So that is one of the ways in which full service has been improved over live service, because those communication channels are more open and it is easier for people. So the second part of our findings is about staff perspectives, and we're incredibly grateful to DWP for giving us access to job centres in Glasgow. We were welcomed and staff were very open in talking to us about how universal credit affected them in their work and in their dealings with claimants. Staff were positive about the flexibilities of universal credit, so they thought that it was an improvement over legacy benefits in relation to flexible working. So previously, under job seekers allowance, for example, if you got a job of over 16 hours, you would have to stop claiming, and then you might be able to claim tax credits, but if you became unemployed again, you'd have to restart your claim. So universal credit does make it possible to move in and out of work more easily than legacy benefits, and job centre staff thought that was a better situation. So staff said, so it just means that customers, they don't have to stop and start claims. They can work for 2 hours, they can work for 20 hours, or they can work full time. Staff also told us that early contact tended to focus on claims issues. So when they had claimants with them, it was difficult to move into discussion of employability support. And that's a long-standing issue. So DWP have had a long-standing strategy of minimising footfall to reduce contact. The appointments that are available are very short, and that's partly due to demand being high and resources being low. Job centre staff did not think that sanctions were effective in influencing claimants positively. So work coaches told us that sanctions don't work, and they also told us that they don't like to use sanctions and that they didn't use sanctions very often. Also, managers told us that they encourage staff not to sanction people. And there was a sense amongst many work coaches that we spoke to that if they sanctioned a claimant, they had failed in their job, and they were very committed to helping people avoid sanctions. They also indicated a change in direction organisationally within Job Centre Plus, that there was less of an emphasis on sanctions than there had been previously. Work coaches were worried about high caseloads during full service rollout, and they were particularly, I don't want to say worried, but they were finding it a challenge to deal with more complex cases. That was often to do with disability and mental health issues, which, although they'd had some training in, they didn't necessarily have very advanced understandings of particular health conditions or what was reasonable in relation to work expectations. So one work coach told us, yeah, the amount of people with serious mental health issues presenting themselves now, what can you do with them? I mean, we've all been sent on mental health training and that, but when they actually sit down in front of you, you look at them and think, you shouldn't be here. And that was something we heard several times of claimants who had conditions, mental and physical health conditions, that meant it wasn't realistic for them to do the type of job search activities that were expected. So work coaches also, this picture on the left of the screen here, it's a good representation of the sense that work coaches had of going into the universal credit process. There was an idea that universal credit should be simpler, it should be easier, and then after they did their training, they went in and found it was really very complex. Claimants also told us that there was nothing really simple about their lives. Their situations were complex and often changing, and they still felt that universal credit as a process treated them in a standardised type of a way. There wasn't much individually tailoring going on. Okay, I'll pass you over now to Laura Robertson from the Poverty Alliance to talk about our policy recommendations.
Thank you, Sharon. So I'm going to move on to talk a bit about the recommendations based on our research. So there are specific policy and operational recommendations that we've made for the UK Government, the Department for Work and Pensions, the Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council based on the findings from our research. We put forward the following key recommendations for the UK Government. Firstly, it is really important to reform universal credit to stop it pulling people into poverty. For claimants in our research, the 5-week wait was the worst aspect of universal credit. The UK Government should end the 5-week wait and end repayable advance payments. We also need to end high rates of deductions, and on the ground, these decisions should always be made at an individual level to ensure that claimants do not end up in financial hardship. Secondly, and extremely pertinent given the reinstatement of sanctions by the UK Government yesterday, there is an urgent need to review the application and necessity of sanctions, particularly given the impacts of COVID-19 on unemployment rates. Standard job search expectations of 35 hours a week in the current job market climate are unrealistic. Additionally, in recognition that the predominantly online universal credit system does not work for everyone, the UK Government could end the digital by default approach by ensuring a mixed approach to managing universal credit claims is always available to claimants. Lastly, all of the claimants we spoke to were experiencing financial hardship as a result of universal credit. To ensure that universal credit provides an adequate source of support, the UK government should reset the value of universal credit in line with cost of living. Moving on to DWP and job centres. We also believe that there are changes that could be made to the operational delivery of universal credit in job centres. Our key recommendations include an important need to invest in Job Centre Plus staff so they can deliver a fully person-centred approach with dignity and respect at its heart. The rollout of universal credit in Glasgow highlighted the need for sufficient numbers of work coaches to manage high and more complex caseloads. Secondly, it is important that the DWP reviews all work-related requirements for universal credit claimants awaiting a work capability assessment to ensure that they are not subject to conditionality whilst they are awaiting their assessment, which is the case under employment and support allowance. Thirdly, claimants should be made aware of additional sources of financial support available to them at the job centre. For example, the Scottish Welfare Fund, discretionary housing payments, and the job centre's flexible support fund. These should be offered consistently. We've also made some recommendations specifically for the Scottish Government. Whilst universal credit is a reserved benefit in Scotland, we believe that the Scottish Government could take further steps to better promote the Scottish Welfare Fund amongst individuals, communities and community groups. Secondly, as claimants we spoke to found local job clubs in the City of Glasgow an invaluable source of support. We therefore recommend that the Scottish Government provides additional support for job clubs across communities in Scotland. Relatedly, whilst Glasgow's safeguarding approach enabled a partnership approach to the delivery of universal credit in the city, including the creation of universal credit support hubs and local libraries, we recommend increased investment in independent advice, advocacy and community-based services for claimants across the city, alongside raising awareness of the Scottish Welfare Fund. The findings from the study have implications for the policy, design and delivery of universal credit, not only in Glasgow, but for the UK as a whole. These recommendations seek to ensure that universal credit meets its aims of simplifying the social security system, preventing and reducing poverty, and more effectively supporting people into employment.
Laura, Sharon, thank you very much indeed for sharing those findings from the report. As I said at the top, the full report and the findings prepared by my colleague Deborah Hay, they're both on the JRF website and we'll be sending them to you if you haven't already had a chance to look at them. There's some really detailed testimony from recipients which was touched upon there, including what their views and experiences some months into their claim after that initial waiting period has been overcome. So what I'd like to do now is introduce Lorraine McGrath from Standing Community Scotland. Laura there touched upon the safeguarding approach that has been developed in Glasgow, which Lorraine and her colleagues have been part of building with DWP, and this is where we turn to look at the extent to which the delivery and operation of universal credit locally can be flexed to hopefully improve the experiences and outcomes that claimants have. So turning now to you, Lorraine, thanks for joining us.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Jim, and thanks, Shan and Laura. As a social care provider, I guess you won't be surprised that I am going to be talking to you about the kind of human element, as Jim said, and the people power, I suppose, that is within any system, and in particular the universal credit system. But first, just a little bit about the organisation. For some reason, it's not moving. My slides are not moving. What have I done wrong? Nope, it doesn't want to move. Sorry, give me a second. I'm going to come back out of that.
We can definitely see your holding slide, Lorraine. Let's see if we can
Yeah,
make
but
it
it's
work.
not. I'm going to have to come out of it, I think.
Lorraine, I think Eleanor from JRF can click these for you. Shall we have a go at that, if you're okay?
Okay, so to the first slide. So Simon Community Scotland's been around a long time, and we are wholly focused on everyone having a safe place to live and access to the support they need. We do that through a whole range of accommodation, outreach and wellbeing services across Central and West Scotland. We probably work with more people experiencing homelessness than anybody else in Scotland, and in particular more people experiencing the most extreme forms of homelessness, including rough sleeping, and that equates to about 5,000 people plus per year. So moving on to the realities of universal credit and homelessness. As the study highlighted, universal credit has brought many new challenges for everybody that's had to use it as a safety net within the welfare system. But for the people we support, those challenges are massively magnified with the instability and all too often the chaos within which they live. That 5-week waiting time, during that time, someone within the most extreme experience of homelessness could be in 5 different addresses in that period, if indeed not more. So their ability to keep track on where things are happening and what's going on for them and survive during that 5-week period are the most extreme challenges that people can face. What I want to talk to you about, though, is some of the things that we've done in partnership with DWP and Job Centre Plus in Glasgow. And that really has started with at the top of the tree in DWP and Job Centre Plus in Scotland with the director level. We know that compassion for the most vulnerable, the 1 or 2% most vulnerable people, probably cannot be designed into a system. It can only be delivered through leadership, opportunity, and appetite to make things happen. And we've seen that in the response that we've worked with DWP to make happen in Glasgow in particular, through the director, giving permission to the whole system in Scotland to look how they can really invest in learning about what works best for that group within a system that's designed for the general population, and how we can take a much more solution-based approach. What that basically looked like is an investment of initially of time to get senior leaders out into the environments, come and spend time doing street outreach with our street teams, and really touching the reality of the lives of the people that we support, and the roles of our staff in trying to navigate a benefit system for those, for the people that they worked with on a day-by-day basis, and just how many challenges each person faced. So we then worked on looking at how do we make that system work for everyone, and how we do that through the realities of it is the frontline staff who are most challenged on both sides of the fence, between the service provider and the Job Centre Plus. How do we make that work? How do we actually give permission and empower people to do what they can within the constraints of the system? And a large part of that came from good understanding of each other's roles and good understanding of the challenges that the people that we support we're working through on a day-by-day basis. That involves job shadowing. It involves empowering the frontline staff of Job Centre Plus with knowledge, training in ACEs, training in trauma-informed practice, looking at how they can apply a psychologically informed approach in their day in, day out contact with people, from the very first moment they meet the person, the claimant, for the first time, right through, and how they can access help and support when they run into trouble. As the research highlighted, that they don't have all the knowledge, and no matter how much training we give them on a short-term basis, are they going to have it? So it's about how do they access the support and who do they need to talk to if they are particularly concerned about that person. The Safeguarding initiative in Glasgow delivers that. We're the only voluntary organisation and social care provider involved in it, out with the City Council staff. And that creates an opportunity to have a named contact for the most vulnerable that can act and represent that person through the UC system and avoid all the pitfalls that a life in chaos and uncertainty and instability can bring. Those opportunities for those frontline Job Centre Plus staff have created a confidence within that system that allows us now to have Job Centre staff for the first time ever actually operating within a social care environment. So we have work coaches who come out and do clinics and deliver that very sufficient time and capacity to work with people on a one-to-one basis, to give them the time and the understanding and the knowledge within the environment that's familiar to them and within the places where they are seeking help, so that they can navigate the system in a much more effective way. That has been hugely powerful, and we're going to expand that in the coming months as we open a big new multi-agency hub in Glasgow, where we will have a dedicated work coach and case manager from Job Centre Plus there on an ongoing basis. The other part of the response is actually working with the management team and the senior management team, who have developed a huge appetite to give much more focus to the most vulnerable groups, and how do we work to deliver more impact. And a lot of the conversations that we've been having as an organisation with Job Centre Plus is, as we look to the Ending Homelessness Together action plan in Scotland, for instance, what role does Job Centre Plus play in that? And for us, that is a very critical role in preventing homelessness in the first place, with the information, the data and the relationship that they have with people before they reach the point of crisis and applying to their local authorities as homeless, but also in the role that they play in resolving homelessness as someone moves into their tenancy or moves on from the instability of rough sleeping. The absolute critical role that Job Centre Plus play in delivering wellbeing. And we're working through a programme just now that is basically applying a presumption of duty to prevent homelessness on frontline Job Centre Plus staff. We were working through a kind of pathway development programme before COVID hit, but we are now looking to develop that into a very fast track response post-COVID. That doesn't mean all these great things that have happened with Job Centre Plus staff. It takes constant investment, and it doesn't mean that we're over the challenges at all. There are many remaining challenges. I think one of the big things for me is that it is a system, and what we've done within that system is very dependent on individuals. It's highly relational. It's about people knowing people and understanding each other's roles. We need to think about how we design a system that gives more power to that on a routine basis. Right now, there's been huge relaxation in the system, particularly for people experiencing homelessness due to COVID-19. As we transition back out, that escalates the risks for people that have entered a system at a time when it has been pretty relaxed and it's been easy to navigate it. We have ongoing challenges with the most extreme digital exclusion for people in homelessness. We did a very quick straw poll a while ago. Only 20% of the people that we supported at that time had ever had an email address. We also have challenges in accessing banking systems, and particularly right now, we know that there's more risk coming. We know that the risk of homelessness and extreme need is, as a result of COVID, is kind of backing up behind a dam somewhere waiting to burst at the end of the furlough scheme. We also know that there's a greater degree of presenting need. First-time homelessness is increasing, but as is complexity of need and complexity of challenges. The logistics that we have to navigate in Glasgow alone are increasing. People are in more diverse locations. They're in much more challenging environments like hotels. And we are seeing escalating levels of avoidable risks because we know that there's good data there and there's good understanding there not just from the point of view of hard data and information within the system, but in terms of, for instance, a work coach intelligence and understanding about that person as they're sitting in front of them that day. All of this really does strengthen the drivers for much more effective integrated working. And I kind of go back to that first point of compassion for the most vulnerable can't be designed into a system. It has to be led, it has to be given permission to, and it has to be empowered. And where it has to be empowered most is in the front line, and everything that we've been doing evidences that whilst there's many, many things wrong with the system, you can work within it to empower a response to the most vulnerable in a more effective way if you have the appetite to do so. Thanks very much.
Lorraine, thank you so much for such a timely and informative set of insights about the possibility of flexing this system so that it starts to work with the grain and for people for whom many, many systems over many years have failed. It's a really important part of this discussion, so thank you for joining us. What I'd like to do now is turn to some of the questions that have been coming in. We've got lots of them, so thank you for those. I'm going to try and group some of them together into themes. I'm going to ask one of our panellists to lead off by answering rather than all of you, and we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. So I want to bring together some questions that have been raised by a number of people, including David Milligan, Joan Ford, Brian Scott for starters, and it's a set of questions around people who are either disabled and or have mental health problems, often fluctuating complex problems. And it's a question about how well we're doing in dealing with the kind of sources of anxiety around universal credit, and also for disabled people, how well we're doing in terms of overcoming digital exclusion and really getting on to employability support that helps disabled people get into work, you know, before and after the pandemic. So set of questions in there around disability and mental health challenges as the client group becomes more diverse and brings a more complex set of needs. Which of you would like to maybe answer that set of questions?
I'm happy to go on that one.
Thanks,
Jim.
Laura.
So based on our research, we spoke to people that said they were experiencing health conditions, and particularly there was quite a few people that said that they were experiencing mental health issues which were exacerbated by claiming universal credit. So in terms of how well UC is supporting claimants who do have health conditions, particularly mental health, there's a lot of evidence that the anxiety around the 5-week wait and the expectations put on claimants was worsening mental health. We've included a couple of specific case studies with individual claimants in our research report, including one of the claimants we spoke to, Karen, who had experienced poor mental health and had applied for employment and support allowance, but had not passed the work capability assessment and been told that she therefore must apply for universal credit. She felt there was no recognition of her mental health problems within the universal credit system, and due to a lack of responses to job applications she'd been making, she just felt really disheartened and that there wasn't support available for her. By the time we spoke to her at a second interview 3 months later, she had not been able to attend an appointment due to her anxiety, and therefore had been threatened with a sanction. She had really good support from her work coach, but she still had to wait for 1 month to hear about the decision, which thankfully they decided not to sanction her. But the stress during that time meant that she ended up having to go to her GP to get a sick note. So yeah, that did come up as a significant issue in the research.
Thanks, Laura. I want to move to look at what's distinctive about the system in Scotland. So we had some questions around what the research found on Scottish choices, so the payment flexibilities that are in place from Anna Stevenson, Maggie Pollock, and also Mark Simpson, one of the co-authors of the Northern Ireland research, asking about does the experience to date tell us we should be seeing greater devolution and decentralisation, at least on some of the delivery and operational sides of universal credit. I wonder, Sharon, do you want to pick that one up?
Yep, I'm happy to pick that up now that my neighbour has stopped cutting his hedge. Yeah, so this is something we were most interested in terms of like what were people's experiences of the Scottish choices, and we thought that more people would actually take these up than seemed to be the case. And part of the reason people said they didn't take up the Scottish choices, for example, to have more frequent payments, was because they thought that once they'd had to wait 5 weeks already, he started cutting his edge again. Once they'd had to wait for 5 weeks, then they'd kind of been forced into like a monthly cycle already, and then it seemed like more hassle to change it back to a fortnightly payment after that. And then there was also some, like, you might think it's definitely better to have a more frequent payment, but what people were saying is that if the money isn't enough, then it doesn't matter so much when you get it, it still doesn't make it enough. So the underlying point is about adequacy. So there was also a situation people could get into, for example, if you had a fortnightly payment and you were responsible for paying your rent, so you got the money for the housing element yourself, it could be confusing, or sometimes people weren't able to save it back, that part of it, so that they would be able to pay their rent when it was due at the end of the month. So you think these things would be helpful, but sometimes it worked out not to be as helpful as it could have been. And it could be a little bit confusing. So there's no simple answer here. And I think also in principle, you might think choice is a good thing. But if the aim is to have a simple system that is helpful, then maybe it is better to have a default. And I don't know, my personal view is that it might be more helpful to have more frequent payments as the default, and then people could opt into a monthly cycle. But it also depends what happens with the 5 week wait, and that's where there was most consensus, is that nobody thought the 5 week wait was a good idea, and everybody found it really difficult, even if they had an advance payment that then had to be paid back. So this also gets on to the point about further devolution. So would it be good to devolve things further? And for me, the main point is not really about devolution, it's about adequacy. So it's about, do people have enough money to pay for the things they need to pay for? And are they secure? Are they financially secure? And are they secure in their housing? And universal credit messes with both of those things, because people don't have enough money and they're really worried. It introduces that housing insecurity that wasn't there under the legacy system. The inadequacy issue was already there under legacy benefits, because legacy benefits weren't adequate either. So I don't personally think that the answer is necessarily greater devolution. If the UK government increased the amount of universal credit to cover the cost of living, then that would be a better solution for everyone in the UK. But then if they don't do that, then it could be better for the Scottish government to have control over that issue so that they could do it. But then we also need to be really honest about what's happened with social security in Scotland. And the legislation and the principles of human rights and dignity, fairness and respect are so important. And that's a massive improvement on the UK principles of, or lack of principles in relation to social security. But we also need to be honest that in Scotland, when the carers benefits were increased, which was a great thing, it was a real improvement and it helped a lot of people, they were only increased to the level of JSA, which we know is inadequate and it doesn't cover all of the costs of living. So there's still a gap at Scottish level between intention and action, and those need to be better lined up in order to really help people.
Sian, thanks. As so often with the kind of devolution, decentralisation debate, questions of purpose and objectives need to come before particular governance arrangements, but that's a really helpful reflection of the Scottish choices thus far. I want to turn and look now a bit more at the Glasgow context and really try and pick out what this might mean for other cities, maybe other similar places. So we have colleagues from other parts of the UK asking questions. For example, Kerry Hughes is asking about, based on her work in Manchester, and maybe this is one for Lorraine, about what we, how universal credit lands in that mix of third sector and statutory services, including employability support. How we make that kind of integration of different services which are accountable at different levels work for people who may otherwise have the toughest time going from pillar to post. And there's a similar question from Lorraine Harrison, who's asking about, you know, if we're going to go down the road of multi-agency hubs which have DWP as part of them, who needs to be part of that mix, and how do we make sure they work well for people that we're talking about today? I wonder, Lorraine, to summarise my very long question, what would you say to other parts of the UK? Where should we be going at the city level with this kind of agenda?
I think when you're talking about the people in the most extreme circumstances, like the people that we support, it's about really understanding where the relationship lies for them, where they will make connections with services, where they have trust in the system, and where there's knowledge about them and understanding about just how they get through the days. And if we can then use that as a really powerful mechanism to support how they navigate the welfare system. So that's really what has happened in Glasgow, is that DWP and Job Centre Plus at a senior level have recognised that if they are going to reach and effectively work within the welfare system for people in the most extreme circumstances, they need to reach the organisations that are best connected with them. And that would be my advice to other cities, is actually transcend those statutory boundaries and recognise that for some people it's about where the best connection for them is, and how do you actually utilise that to make sure that the system works as effectively for them as it possibly can, and where the understanding about that group is. And the multi-agency hub, I suppose the new access hub in Glasgow is going to be a kind of representation of that, not just in relation to immediate homelessness response and crisis response, but it's a wellbeing hub that looks at every aspect of advice and information and intervention around people's wellbeing. Who is actually operating within that has been built up on the basis of intelligence of the people that will use it, and the other services and systems that exist already within the city. So there's no cake mix for an environment like that. I think it's got to be based on really, really good local understanding. And the last thing we want to do is create more confusion within the system and create more points of contact for the same thing. We want single points of contact as much as we possibly can, so that you empower skill and competence within frontline staff teams, and you make the best use of the skill and capacity and resources of organisations and target them as strongly as possible. And the hub will be a place predominantly for the more difficult things to access. It shouldn't be true, but like health and benefit system, we're going to make that easy in the hub, and that's the big agenda, is how do you make it easy to access things, and how do you use the system that's already there to do that.
Lorraine, thank you. One thing I take from that is for DWP colleagues who are joining this webinar or watching it back, I suppose you have to take some confidence from where that relationship building has got at the city level, and possibly some of the lessons from Glasgow could be influential in other parts of the UK, and indeed vice versa. There'll be things that are happening that are innovations to try and make the system work better for those having the toughest time. Not instead of the reforms we need at the UK level, but certainly as complementary ones. Thank you for that. We have only a few minutes left, so I want to take another kind of combined question, and this is from Linda Swanson, Martin Talbot, and they're both asking, maybe this is for Laura or Sharon, to what extent you found people actually being moved to find decent jobs, and maybe even in time off universal credit. Now, I know this research was looking at early experiences of full service, and there were various complex issues to be worked through before people felt able to get onto the front foot with job seeking. But is it fair to have good work as the kind of ultimate measure of success for universal credit, at least for some people who are claiming it? How do you think we're doing on that measure pre-COVID?
So that's a tricky question, isn't it? It's like the $1 million question. So it's hard to tell whether people move into work because of the help that they get from Job Centre Plus, or if they are moving into work of their own accord. So it's hard to establish that. So in this study, it was a small sample of people that we spoke to. So there's no, we can't say, what proportion of people moved into work or that kind of thing. There was only a couple of people who had employment either at wave A or wave B of the study. And what people generally, well, the general experience of those we spoke to was quite stable. Not that much had really changed in their lives. They wanted to work, but they weren't always able to find a job. And the thing that came out more than concerns about work were concerns about basic things. So it's almost like it took up the bandwidth, the initial sort of financial crisis of how can I eat, how can I house myself and my dependents, how can I get by? And then people wanted to work, but weren't always able to find opportunities. And even those who were in employment still were struggling financially. So it's a tricky question, also because work coaches have such short interviews. They're not able to give very much employability support at all. So the sorts of things that they were doing was giving advice about how to prepare for an interview, for example, or giving some advice about a CV. But the interviews are too short to allow any very in-depth support. And the UK system is quite different from other countries where they have all sorts of types of support that we don't offer in the UK. So in-depth training, for example, it's only very basic training that's available in the UK, or in-depth sort of psychological support. In Norway, for example, they have trained psychologists and counsellors who work in job centres and can actually give people direct help with their mental health. And in other countries, they have job guarantee schemes. We don't have that in the UK. So another area for action could be to think about how can the government or the Scottish government or locally, how can we take action to offer jobs or to guarantee jobs rather than just to push people towards looking for work that either doesn't exist or is difficult to find.
Sharon, thank you. And there are a number of questions, which I won't go over them all, exactly about the kind of job market horizons that people are going to have ahead of them, especially people who are coming out of foundational sector jobs, with qualifications and experience, which may be harder to switch into other sectors. And so where we go on employment at a macro level and in Scotland, it's going to be an incredibly important part of how successfully universal credit can drive some of those job outcomes. I want to just finish really briefly with a set of questions about where we should go next in terms of flexing universal credit and going at a pace that reflects and indeed respects what's happening with COVID, unwinding of furlough, and so on. And the questions come from a number of people, including Chris McGinley and Elspeth Kerr, about how we can make sure we don't switch conditionality back on in a way that people find impossible to engage with. What people are thinking here about libraries not being open, having a hard time getting online, quite apart from the fact the vacancy rate currently in Glasgow and Edinburgh is more than 60% down since March. Can I have one line from each of you to finish on what your advice would be to the Secretary of State?
Scrap sanctions.
Okay, and Laura?
I guess, yeah, just making sure that there is not full conditionality at the moment, so not making people apply for jobs that don't exist.
Thank you. And Lorraine, you have the final word.
Yeah, I think just a greater recognition that whilst the system's designed for the general population, there is a small percentage of people that cannot navigate this system, and that needs to be recognised.
Thank you all for those really valuable and timely insights. We've now come to the end of the webinar. All I wanted to do is thank the panel, Sharon, Laura and Lorraine, for sharing those thoughts with us. Thank all of you for joining us at this JRF webinar. As we said, the full set of findings, both for Glasgow and the Northern Ireland research out this week as well, are available on our website, and we will send them to you for follow-up. We will endeavour to pull together some more responses to some of the questions you've been raising. The webinar is available to be watched back, so that'll be available for people as well who weren't able to join us today. Just one thing to say as well, at JRF in Scotland in particular, we are looking over the summer at the way in which a lifeline can be created using devolved and local powers from a housing perspective to make sure that a public crisis becoming quickly an economic crisis does not then spill over into deep housing insecurity. So we'll be looking at that, and we've got some polling insights that we've put out recently, and there'll be other JRF webinars coming your way soon if those are of interest. Just finish finally by thanking my colleague Deborah Hay, who's worked on this project from the start to manage it to successful completion. Eleanor Boyle, Michelle Atkins, Rachel Berry, all at JRF who've helped to put this webinar together. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and have a very good afternoon. Thank you.